In accordance with the customs of this university, I open this ceremony with a prayer. Spiritus Sancti gratia illuminet sensus et corda nostra, which, in case you're wondering, means we pray that the Holy Spirit enlightens our mind and heart. Okay, with that, let's take a seat. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this academic ceremony in which Sushrut Thorat will defend his dissertations. Because of the international composition of the promotion committee and indeed of the candidate himself, this session will be held in English. I would like to address a special word of welcome to the members of the promotion committee who traveled from their home universities to be present here today, either physically or on Zoom. The Zoom opponents will be revealed to you later. Thank you very much for your participation, and I start by giving the floor to the candidate of the degree of doctor.
Thank you, honored sir. With the permission of the doctorate board, and in order to obtain the degree of doctor from Radboud University, Nijmegen, I would like to defend in public my dissertation entitled Smart Search, Investigations into Human Visual Search in Structured Environments. I just proceed, right? Yeah, okay. So, let me take you on a tour of the thesis. I'll try to tell you why our visual search behavior is smart. So let's start with a scenario. You go into your friend's kitchen, you want to wash something, you're looking for a faucet. So let's say this is the kitchen you went into. Where is the faucet? Most people, and I think all people, do not do sequential scanning of the scene where you're just looking at the different parts of the scene and checking if there's a faucet or not. What you do is you use knowledge about where objects are located in the world and what their relationships are with respect to other objects to make your search smart. So in this case, for example, you know that faucets exist on kitchen counters. So probably the only places you look at in the scene are on the kitchen counter. Then you also know that faucets have a particular shape where they bend on the top, for example, as compared to pans which are flat. So you probably take that into account while searching for the faucet in this space. So you have predictable location, and then you have distinct features about that object. And you use these elements to get to the faucet as fast as you can and not need to search throughout the entire display. So it seems simple, finding the kitchen counter and knowing how the faucet looks like, and then we get to the faucet. It sounds very simple, but these operations are extremely complex. Like you have to parse what a particular object is, what a particular part of the scene contains. That parsing is really hard, and it's hard to communicate how complex this process is, but I can give you a parallel. So it's really hard to design artificial agents to do the same thing. So you might have heard about machine learning or artificial intelligence, and those systems still find it really hard to either locate or identify objects in given images, or parsing scenes in their whole richness. So this part of visual search has been studied in a field called cognitive science or cognitive visual neuroscience since the 1950s, and my thesis is the next step on this adventure we have been having in this particular field. I'll discuss two central chapters of the thesis in this talk, possibly discussing stuff that might interest you. So one of the elements which makes our search smart is that we can deploy it parallelly, and then we can also use structures in the environment to reduce the complexity of the search, to make it simpler. So I'll talk about what work I did on these fronts. So let's start with parallel search. So if I show you these two displays filled with O's and N's and ask you where is the red O, so it's here in the left display. I don't know if you can see my cursor. I guess you can. And it's here on the right display. You might have noticed that it's harder to find it on the right display than the left display. And you actually, if you structurally study the dependence of how much time it takes to find the red O on how many red N's there are as opposed to how many black O's there are, then what you find is that reaction time is only dependent on the number of red N's. suggesting that we select the red items in parallel across the image. You don't need to look at every single item to know if it's red or not. It's as if you can just completely filter out all the black stuff, and all you see is the red stuff, and then you just move your eyes along the red stuff, and you find the red O. So this is a global effect in a sense that we are deploying a particular process across the entire visual field. And it has been well studied for simple or simpler properties such as colors of the items or orientations of the items or simple letters like N's and O's. But there has been a long-standing question as to if we can globally select high-level properties such as shapes or categories. So dogs as a category, any possible dog. Or as we saw, any possible faucet. You don't know how the faucet looks like a priori. There's multiple views they could have. There's multiple shapes they could have. And it's unclear if we can deploy this parallel search for high-level properties. And that's what I studied in chapter 2. So what we did was we had this experiment where people saw 4 boxes. And in each of these boxes, they could find silhouettes of objects. So you could see a human body, you could see a lamp, you could see a chair. So we had 6 of these different types of objects with multiple exemplars of each object. So what you do is you look at the vertically aligned boxes, and maybe we tell you to look for a car. So different types of objects keep flashing, and you have to press a button when you see a car in either of the 2 vertically aligned boxes. And in the horizontal boxes, other types of objects are also flashing. So your task is to find an object in the vertical boxes. These locations, the horizontal locations, are task irrelevant. Now, although you ignore it during search, we analyzed them, and we wanted to know what happens in the brain in response to what is shown in these task irrelevant locations. So we decided to focus on human bodies first. We wanted to know if you could look for a body parallelly across your visual field. So for that, we selected this part of the brain called the body selective cortex, or the extrastriate body area. What this piece of cortex has is that it has a higher response when you show a picture of a body as compared to if you show a picture of anything else. So we put people in the scanner, in an MRI scanner, and we looked at their brain's responses as they performed this task. What we found that is in this body selective cortex, the body selectivity, so higher response for body than for other objects, was higher when you are looking for bodies in the vertical boxes than when you are looking for any other object in the vertical boxes. So it's as if you're looking for bodies in the vertical boxes, but it just so happens that you deploy the same processes even in the locations, neural locations corresponding to the horizontal boxes. So you could say in very layman terms that looking for bodies in one part of the image seems similar to looking for bodies all over the image. So this is the kind of global effect we found for simpler properties, but now we also found it for a high-level property, which is object shape, because here the bodies really vary a lot on how they look. So the second element which might be interesting to you is complexity reduction. So there is this idea in the field that items that occur together can be grouped into super items. So you see here there's an egg on top of an egg cup, there is an umbrella on top of a beach chair, and they always occur in these particular arrangements. You never see a beach chair under a, you don't see an umbrella under a beach chair ever. So because you see them in a particular arrangement, you could imagine that you could just, when you're parsing a scene, when you're trying to understand what's there in a scene, you could just group them into one big object. You can be like, okay, that's where you can go and chill on a beach. And you don't need to process exactly, this is a chair, that's an umbrella. What can this get us? So this could lead to a reduction in the effective number of items. If you're trying to understand what all is there in the scene, if you just group all these co-occurring objects, then it's like instead of 10 objects, you have 5 objects. And what that does is it could lead to better search, because now if you're trying to look for an object, instead of having 5 distractors, you have 10 distractors, you have 5 distractors. So is this actually the case? Can we see a signature like this in human behavior? That's what we investigated in chapter 5. So what we did is we had these abstract shapes. There was one target which was cued before this display was shown. And here it's indicated in yellow. The color was not shown during the actual experiment. And your task was to basically say where that target was, on the left side of the display or right side of the display. Now, unknown to the participants, there were two types of scenes that were shown. One, we had structured scenes where the distractors were paired. So for example, you see these two distractors, this TIE fighter-like thing, and then I don't know what this is. It's like a hexagon, which has a cut. So you see the same pairs repeated on different displays. And then you had 3 more of these pairs, which are also repeated across displays. So you have structure in these scenes where you're trying to do, within which you're trying to do search. And then you had unstructured scenes where the distractors are not paired. So for example, here you see this triangular shape. It's paired with this camera-like object, then it's paired with, I don't know, a tail-like object. And so the partners keep changing, so the distractors don't co-occur with other distractors in particular arrangements. So the question was, because you have this structure in the structured scenes, could participants actually group these co-occurring objects, and then we have reduced number of distractors, and then we see a better search performance? So what we saw is, yeah, indeed, if you look at the accuracy and the reaction times across 1,000 participants, in the structured scenes, they are more accurate, and they are faster than in the unstructured scenes in finding the target that is shown in yellow, for example. So yeah, shape co-occurrences could be learned and used to make search efficient. And this tells us that complexity reduction due to group distractors might actually improve search. So yeah, what do you take away from this? One, hopefully these 2 examples, small examples, but still, convince you that visual search is not random. It actually uses very specialized smart operations such as parallel search or complexity reduction. One, we can actually look for faces or bodies across the visual field at once. What we don't know if this generalizes to other objects. Can we look for cars or lamps in a similar fashion across your entire visual field? That's unclear. And objects occurring together could be processed as a group, making it easier to process scenes. And how the brain processes these co-occurring objects is also not known. So those are avenues for further research. And to me, this point is very important. I'm always interested in which of these insights or related research might actually be helpful in building better artificial intelligence systems or leading advances in identifying neural disorders or treating them. That is something very important to me, and I don't know the answer to this, but this is something I keep thinking about, and hopefully you also think about these processes, because as Finman said, what I cannot create, I do not understand, and that's what I also live by. So this is the first part in this kind of exploration of how to actually understand human visual search. You first study it in humans, try to understand how the brain works, and then hopefully we can build better machines which can do similarly smart operations in its behavior. Thank you. Having presented this summary of my dissertation, I return the floor to the rector.
Thank you for this very clear summary indeed. We now proceed with the defense of your dissertation. And I should point out that the gentleman on the left of me will remain silent during this defense. They have talked enough during your 4 years of the dissertation. So we are going to give the word to the opposition. We have 1 member physically present, and the other members are present via Zoom. And we start the defense by giving the word to Professor Uta Noppenay, who is professor at our own university, and she was also the head of the manuscript committee. Professor Noppenay.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to congratulate you to this excellent thesis. I really enjoyed reading it, and I've learned quite a lot and found it very intriguing. I have a couple of questions. So let's start with the final experiment that you showed, where you basically presented. So you interpreted that structure really facilitates search. And I was wondering, but what you showed is that that you basically, when you present 2 stimuli always together, right? They basically make search more efficient. And this could be because if you present 2 stimuli always together, they just form object representations, right? As you're probably aware, there's a study by Daniel Wolpert where they even show that when you do it in a cross-modal way, you can't really distinguish those. So my question is is this really something to do with this specific for search? Or is this not just like, okay, you have object presentations and then object representations, and now you have fewer objects, and of course, then visual search will be faster and more efficient? Or is it that it's really like structure? I mean, you can also generate structures in a different way, right? You can also other different types of statistical structure, which does not rely really on generating object representations.
Honored madam, thanks for your nice comments. I agree with you that that's one way of thinking about it, that if two objects are co-occurring, you could think about them as one super object. It actually creates an object representation. You can't actually tease apart the constituents. And this is exactly what we started with. So we are like, okay, we see these studies showing that if two objects co-occur, it's almost treated like one object. Then can we show, if we take this now, this piece of knowledge, and put it in a search context, can we actually show that it acts as if the number of distractors have reduced? So this is like empirical evidence for exactly what you're trying to say. But it just so turns out that the effect sizes are extremely small. So it's not trivial, this account, at least. That's what I would like to say. Well, I can't necessarily very strongly say that this is happening unless I see it in a corresponding neural study or something like that, which we could not in chapter 6. So yeah.
But if you think about like other, so for instance, you could also make you could also generate like similar repetitions, but you make deliberately the two co-occurring object components always very far apart in space, right? So thereby you could basically minimize even the emergence of an object representation, right? Because the cue that something is very far apart in space would go against generating like an object. So that's my question now. Is it really like that you basically just simplify because you have these sort of repetitions of or this sort of structure, or is it really like the object stuff?
I think it is related to the object stuff, or at least we would like to believe that, because what you're suggesting is very similar to, it comes very close to contextual cueing, like that, because there you don't really have parts that co-occur necessarily, but you have entire displays which are repeated, right? Now, if you want to have pieces of those displays stay constant and just move around in different displays, that's what we are doing. So I'm a bit confused, like what you are suggesting exactly, like is...
So I was thinking you can also generate like basically exactly, you keep it exactly, you have like two object components, but by making them really far apart in space, you probably, this will probably antagonize the emergence of a single object, right? Because usually things that go together close in space, they're going to be, this is one object. But nevertheless, otherwise you could keep it quite the same. And so then you would probably suggest what? It would go down even, you would be even less efficient.
With the accounts suggested, proposed in the thesis, yes. Like, I don't think it should lead to structure benefit, because then it's really hard to know what even the difference is between the unstructured scenes and the structured scenes in that case, right? Because in the unstructured scenes, you would also have objects which are further away. So...
But it's not always going to be the same that co-occur, right? It's going to be the same that always co-occur. So that's not like an unstructured scene, right?
So it's location-tied co-occurrence. I see. Yeah, that's interesting. I don't have an answer to that, but I would, with these accounts, at least where we come from to this study, I would think that you would not see as much structured benefit, if at all. I don't know if we can learn those long-range dependencies in the same way we can learn these short-range dependencies. But I'm speculating here, so yeah.
Yeah, great. Thanks. I've got a question to chapter number 2 about your feature-based attention. So in addition to feature-based attention that you manipulate, you also manipulate spatial attention, right? Because, well, you don't manipulate it all, but we manipulate it in the way that you always have to focus on the ones that are in the middle, basically, in the center of the screen. So my question, how do the two basically interact? So let's assume you have manipulated also the distance of the ones that you need to attend to in the center with the ones that have the same feature. So they're attended based on the sort of parallel feature search, but they're more far apart. So then how would this interact? What do you think? Because you would have like a spatial focus, right? Like maybe like a sort of simplistic, say like a attentional spotlight.
Right. This has been dealt with in previous studies. I mean, since the beginning, like people tried to tease these apart. So As far as I understand, it would just reduce the effect you see. So that you can almost think about them as additive or multiplicative interactions, spatial attention plus feature-based attention. So it's as if you deploy feature-based attention in all of space, and then you put on spatial attention on top of that. A very simplified account.
Yeah,
so then
but
in
is
that,
it additive or is it multiplicative? That's exactly my question. Would it be additive? Is it multiplicative? How would it be?
So yeah, I can't say for sure. I'm tempted to say multiplicative, but I can't cite a paper off my mind immediately. Yeah, I don't know. But they interact. They interact in a particular way. But yeah, it would reduce.
One final sort of like broader question, right? So you use basically neural network modeling, and you also sort of inserted this attentional effect. And I was wondering, like, there's of course like right now this sort of wave of transformer networks coming in, which is now, and there are quite a few studies comparing transformer networks in the natural language processing field with humans. But so far, I believe, but I haven't looked deeply into it, there's very little in terms of vision and attention, right? And I was wondering, what do you think is this? Would it be useful to go down this route? If yes, why? Why not? What do you think is the role basically of different network architectures in modeling attention?
Yeah, that's a really nice line of questions.
Please a short answer to the question.
Okay, very short. Okay, so transformers, I don't think is exactly the model I would go to think about how the ventral stream works, because in transformers, even in the first layer, that's like V1 level features, you have interactions across the entire image. That's, if you want to make a parallel with the human brain, that's related to recurrence. Like you would need recurrence on top of a feed-forward stream that we have. So it's not very easy to see the link between the two. At least the interactions are extremely long range. So I wouldn't necessarily jump on a transformer immediately to model anything in the ventral stream. But if it helps, then we can backtrace from okay, a transformer relates to ventral stream, and then figure out like what interactions in the ventral stream lead to the representations that we see in transformers. Something like that.
Okay, thank you very much. So I give the word back to the rector.
Thanks.
Thank you. Then we will continue the opposition with Professor Tim Kietzman, who is a professor at the University of Osnabrück.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me all right. Dear candidate, thank you very much for a beautiful thesis. That was indeed a pleasure to read and a good summary, where you skipped the chapters that I found most interesting, but I'll have this chance to dive into them. But I'll start with the chapter you did cover, chapter 2. And it focused on bodies or body shape as a feature that is accessible to parallel search. And I was curious on your large scale thoughts or high level thoughts on why bodies are special. Why would bodies have this special status? We know we can do parallel search for faces. I mean, that's where we started, and now you expanded it to bodies. Is it about the topography of the visual cortex and the typical occurrence of bodies? Is it the ecological importance of bodies? And what other categories do you think would allow for parallel search? Because clearly not all of them work this way, right? Otherwise we couldn't have distractors of various objects and only the face pops out, right? So a lot of objects we can rule out. So why would bodies be special?
Honored sir, thanks for your comments. That's a question I keep asking myself every time I read the chapter. So it's quite nice. One of the things is that if you read directly from the chapter, then it's hard to say anything about the other objects because the signal was just not there. But let's assume the signal was there and we did not find those effects for the other objects as a truth, that it's only for bodies. Then one of the things we latch on to, if you want to like posit a special role for faces and bodies, is that they are indeed ecologically relevant, as you pointed out. They are probably the most ecologically relevant objects. So you have specialized processing streams in the brain. You have the FBA, the EBA, the FFA, and these specialized structures don't exist for other objects. So that indeed, we know that they are special, but why then we don't have attention for the other objects? I don't know, to be sure. I don't know how to answer that, because it might be the case that you need very specialized neurons, like almost like body selective neurons, like a group of them, on which you can do this feature similarity gain modulation kind of operation. We don't have those kinds of neurons for any other objects. So they are scattered. Like you can find population coding in LOC or VTC for the other objects, but you don't have like specialized neurons. So I don't know, maybe it might be the case that you can't target those features specifically in the same way you target bodies from like whatever top-down modulation is leading to these feature-based attention, like this global feature-based attention effects. So that's my best guess for now. So ecologically relevant, therefore something special, and therefore special structures in the brain, and therefore probably amenable to these kinds of modulations. Now we don't know exactly how these modulations work with the structures that we have in the brain. So I find it hard to exactly say why we might not be able to find them for other objects, and what other objects we might be able to find them for. Other object categories which are very related, closely related to faces and bodies, probably like faces of other animals. It could be the case that for animate categories, it is possible to deploy such parallel search. I have not seen, I don't think studies come to my mind where I have seen evidence for this. Definitely not neurally, but even behaviorally. But I would assume just because the neural coding is similar in the brain for animate categories, or at least mammal faces and stuff like that. Maybe you can look for a monkey face also parallelly, but that's about all I can think about it on that now.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We'll change topic with the next question, and we'll change modality from fMRI to modeling. We'll enter chapter 3, where you talk about different networks that have attentional capacity, and you talk about neural capacity and representational capacity. And neural capacity is being defined as the number of units in a hidden layer that the network has at its disposal, and representational capacity you define interestingly, and that's my question. Representational capacity, you say, is lower in a network that's trained with more parallel objects or more blurry input, right? So more complex visual input would be a lower representational capacity.
It's exactly the opposite. If you in chapter 3, if you train on the full range of manipulations, which is multiple objects or blur and stuff, that's the high RC case. So that's where you have the high representational capacity. So
okay, I think I've read it 3 times, but it's fair. If I got that wrong, then that's fair. Because my question was exactly why would it be this way and not the other way? Because it doesn't make sense.
Oh, sorry if
yeah. Okay, so then I'll change my question. So I wanted to ask, my suspicion was that if there's multiple objects, you would probably have a higher effective dimensionality of the model rather than one individual object, which you can, project into a low dimensional space, and therefore the representation capacity should be larger with more. But if that's a misunderstanding, fine, I'll take it on me. The second question I have to this chapter, though, is that you report a reduced, on page 40 of your thesis, a reduced effect of gain for networks with fewer units, right? So smaller neural capacity had smaller gain. And I was curious on what you think is the reason for that. Because again, you could intuitively start saying that you could benefit more from gain if you had to remix like limited resources rather than just picking from larger resources.
Yeah, so this is a tricky issue in this case because so there are two factors here. One is that if indeed it's a smaller network, then it just does not have enough neurons, doesn't have enough operations that it could switch into because of this top-down signal. That could lead to an increased performance. So if I bring in insights from chapter 4, the idea is that if you do this top-down modulation, it state switches into the task that you want to perform at hand. So if we agree on that, then it would be harder to do so in a smaller network just because you don't have enough operations that you could do in a smaller network. But then on the other hand, I agree, if it's a smaller network, then you have more room to improve. But then I think this is a tussle between the two factors. So there could be an inverted U shape, and we just missed it completely because we go from 8 to 32 to 3000. And that's an interesting thing to check out, probably. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. I think I've used my 8 minutes. I can't ask my question about switching, but I'll do that later on when we see each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. We will move then to the next candidate, or the next opponent, I should say, who is also joining us on Zoom, and this is Dr. Viola Sturmer from Dartmouth College in the US.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for this nice presentation and also for the nice thesis that you wrote. And so I have a couple of questions. I'm going to start with questions about chapters 5 and 6. And so the first question is that I think was never shown in the manuscript or today, but it seems like what you think is going on, that participants are kind of like learning, right, almost unconsciously about these distractor configurations. And so the first question that I had was whether you ever looked at kind of how quickly these effects emerge, right? So you're only focusing on the testing block, which makes sense, but how quickly actually do you find kind of these, I mean, these effects are really small, but my first question was kind of how quickly do they emerge, how fast people are learning that, and can you also tease apart these kind of learning effects, whether they're long-lasting or whether this is what degree this is due to kind of inter-trial priming. So I've just seen this configuration on trial N-1, and I just see it again, and does that kind of result in kind of more efficient search? That's kind of the first more detailed methodological question that I have.
Honored Madam, thanks for your kind comments, and that's a nice question. So we did look at the training curve, and we don't find these effects in any of the blocked blocks. So we only find them in the interleaved condition, but that might be because of multiple reasons. One might be that when it's blocked, you can just have some block level strategies. So you're seeing the same scenes over and over again, and exactly as you said, we could have inter-trial priming come in, and then you can just have both the conditions at ceiling. So you don't see any effect. And so to break that, we had the interleaved block at the end. And there we indeed see the effect. So we did see that contrast, and it's like, okay, so this is not about very simple intertrial priming anymore. There is something that has been extracted, and now we can actually tease them apart in this interleaved block. So that would be an answer to the learning and the intertrial priming kind of opposition to. But I agree that we can't really say much about how these things are learned, how long it takes to learn, and how long they persist. Although my suspicion is that they don't really persist for too long, because in chapter 6 we had these across session stuff, right? Like we had the training session and then the second session, and we don't really even see correlations across participants, like who has higher structured benefit has the same higher structured benefit in session 2. So it looks like they just forget, and probably for a good reason. They're abstract shapes. If you hold on to these co-occurrences, it probably might be detrimental in the real world. So that's what I would think about it.
Thanks. So what do you think are people learning exactly? Do you think this is more of an active suppression of these very well-known distractor configurations, or do you think this is something very habitual, kind of more like habit-like attention, the way that Yulong Jiang kind of talks about, I guess, contextual tuning or kind of target probability learning, and the same basically for the distractor side? So is it just like exposure to these types of distractor displays that helps, or is it important that they're actually distractors in a search task? Like, do you think you would find the same effects if you just showed these displays and people were not doing search, but they were just like familiarizing themselves with certain configurations more than others? So there's some recent work by Joy Gang that kind of shows that for low-level features, not for pairs of features, that just passive exposure might already drive some of this distractor learning. So what do you think is going on in your paradigm?
Yeah, so that's so we wanted to keep the entire exposure passive, or not even passive, like active suppression kind of account, because indeed if you show these pairs, like studies by Nick Brown and others also show, like if you just show these pairs, of course participants immediately like understand like what the structure is, and they can even report that in a post-experiment familiarity judgment task. What we wanted to do was really make participants engage in this suppression kind of account, as you suggested in the beginning. And I think that is what is happening. So you're learning the distractor co-occurrences to suppress them better. Now, how is the suppression happening? Do you need to actually know what the distractor co-occurrences are and then use it to suppress actively, like almost like a statistical learning in the hippocampus using it in ventral stream kind of account? Or is it more similar to perceptual learning even, that there's some recurrent processes in the brain which you can like utilize to figure out some sort of distractor center surround suppression kind of account? Which which is a very funny account. I don't know if that actually happens, but that's what I also wrote in the discussion. I don't know, and that's exactly why we were banking very heavily on chapter 6 to give us some insights, but unfortunately we had null results.
Yeah. So maybe one follow-up question,
Yes.
just about this. So then you, in chapter 6, you don't find really differences between the N2PC component, right? Which we think like reflects attention orienting. But now, given your account of this active suppression, could you think of any other kind of neural measures or paradigms that you could use to actually more directly maybe measure suppression per se and not this attention orienting, which possibly is not affected? It's a little hard to tell because maybe it's just not reliable, but it seems like you don't have evidence for that at least.
So yes, that was the second part of chapter 6, right, where we tried to look at the representations of the pairs, and we were hoping that we see some sort of distinction in the neural representations for the grouped pairs and the non-grouped pairs, but we didn't, and I think it's just because the number of participants are extremely low, so we don't have the grouping effect in the first place. So it was almost like a almost like a prayer, I would say, like, oh, maybe we'll find something in the neural effects, and we did not. We thought the neural measures might be stronger than the behavioral measures, but it turns out that in this case they are not. So it was all a bit sad, but yeah.
Yeah, I know. I thought that was very optimistic, your the reasoning that maybe the effect is going to be much bigger with EEG than with behavior.
True. Well, I was new to
for the N2PC, maybe for the decoding is like pretty hard to do in EEG for sure.
Yeah.
Very, very little SNR. Okay, so maybe I move to a much broader question that's I think probably mostly related to your chapter 2 and chapter 1 too, of just thinking about what types of things I guess we can tune our attention to. And so you kind of talk about visual features and body as a visual feature and kind of make the argument that because you find these spatially global effects of kind of tuning attention to bodies, that suggests that bodies is like a feature, but there's a lot of like, I guess my really broad question is what is a visual feature? Like what would you consider a visual feature? What are the kind of prerequisites for us to call something a visual feature? And is it important to distinguish between visual features versus objects when we think about attention and attention selection, right? There's a long history of kind of talking about feature-based attention, but also object-based attention. What are you looking at here really? Is this object-based attention or feature-based attention? Does this distinction make sense at all when we kind of think about attentional limits and attentional operations? So I'd like you to kind of speculate a little bit here.
It's a broad question, but please try to give a concise answer.
Yes, I'll try. Okay, if I have to be very precise, the way I think about features is if you take a convolutional neural network, the channel dimension are features. So you have the spatial variance, which corresponds to the receptive fields, and then you have the channels, right? And each of those neurons correspond to features, or superpositions of those neurons correspond to features. That is what like my very neuro AI idea would be. But then coming back to neuroscience or cognitive neuroscience, my reading says that whatever you can find flat slopes for is a feature in search. So like that was almost how features were defined in the early days. Like this is a feature and that's a conjunction of features, so to say. So I found that from a mechanistic point of view, very unsatisfying or unsettling. So that's why I think about it in this different way. But I don't think it's necessarily very important to think about like these distinctions with respect to feature-based attention, like the object-based account or object-based attention versus feature-based attention as such, because it's really about what kind of neural populations can you modulate across the entire field. So you have different parts of cortex having different receptive fields and having like similar response profiles across the entire visual field, and which kind of populations, which kind of neural signatures can you do these operations on across the entire visual field. And
I'm afraid we need to move on. So thanks, Dr. Sturmer, for your question. And we will move to the next opponent. We will stay in the USA, but now move to New York University, to Dr. Grace Lindsay, who is also joining us via Zoom.
Thank you. And thanks for that presentation and for the thesis and the very interesting literature review that the thesis had. So I'm going to start with some of my more technical questions. In your modeling work, you explore using bias or gain changes and both together. And how I understood it, the bias, if it's the only mechanism, can work to increase performance, but when given both, the model seems to prefer to put most of the weight on the gain. And I wanted to hear your thoughts about why gain would be the more commonly used mechanism for this kind of work.
Honored Madam, thank you for your kind words. So I think in this case, gain is having a huge impact because of the gradients. So I guess because gain operates on whatever is coming in, it doesn't really add anything. It just modulates the information that's coming in. If you make slight adjustments in a multiplicative sense to what's coming in than an additive sense, it might disrupt further processing more so. So it might just be that the gradients are higher in terms of the associated loss for gain than for bias, and so when deployed together, gain takes over. Like that's I think in this case that is what I think that is happening. And
so you think it's like the magnitude of the effect is higher for these gain modulation?
The disruption caused by any issues in gain might be way higher than any issues in bias. So you might have a way flatter region for bias having the same loss than for gain. Maybe you need to be way more precise in the gain space. But that's, again, a speculation. I didn't really check the loss landscapes. Yeah.
But so how would that relate to the actual biology if it's not being trained with gradient descent?
If it is being trained with gradient descent?
If the brain is not, yeah.
So I don't think it directly relates to the biology. Like at least this specific thing that just because you're using gradient descent that you get this kind of profile. What might be interesting for biology in terms of gain versus bias is just the fact that with gain modulation, you do not add any information so you can't put a 3 onto V1 with gain modulation unless there is some sort of information coming in V1. So there's an appeal to that kind of account where you're only modulating information and not like adding anything on it, almost like in a predictive coding sense, where like the very hardcore account where you actually go and actually write on the pixels. But it's more like, okay, given what is coming in from the world and given what I'm trying to do, can you tell me what I need to pass through? So that to me seems like a very multiplicative account. But again, this is all all an intuition. Like I don't have any.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. In chapter 2, when you talk about the evidence for spatially global body feature attention, as I understood in the behavioral results, you also got increased false alarms for all of the categories, but the neural effects seem to only be there for the body attention. Can you kind of explain that? If the behavioral effect is there for all the categories, where is the neural effect that's implementing that?
Yeah, that's a nice question. I think we were a bit too ambitious with the backward masking and the masking on the display itself. Like the stimuli are just really hard to see. So it might be the case that they just did not lead to useful neural responses in the brain. So if there's just no baseline transfer between baseline experiment there's no cross decoding or cross transfer across the experiments either. So we just don't have neural signal for the other categories. And then, of course, we cannot talk about modulation at all. So it might have been the case that we shot ourselves in the leg by introducing too much degradation of the objects. Because the neural signal is definitely more sensitive to these things than our interpretation of what's happening in the world, because we don't have access to single neurons, right? So it might be the case that just the the resolution is not enough to pick up on these extremely subtle differences that the brain might be using to lead to its behavior, which leads to the false alarms. Yeah, I think it's that. Yeah.
Okay, that relates to another question that I had, which is a bit broader. For something like visual search, which has a lot of temporal dynamics and it has concepts of feature representation and then fine spatial resolution and all these things, what are your thoughts on the suitability of the methods that we have for understanding human neural activity, like fMRI and EEG? Where are they appropriate in the study of visual search and where may they not be?
That's a hard question. Okay. So when it comes to things like feature-based, like there are these factors that we study, right? Like feature-based attention versus spatial attention. Like we kind of try to factorize our study of search into these different operations, and that might not be all. Like there's probably way more stuff, but at least for these simple operations, we can create hypotheses about like where in the visual feature hierarchy should this operation happen, and when can this happen, given both the temporal dynamics of the brain and just how much information you need to extract from the display, something like that. So on those two different questions, you could use the two different methods, right? Because if you want to know exactly where in the hierarchy it is, then you use MRI, because we don't have any other method which can give us that much temporal, that much spatial resolution. So for example, in this case, we really wanted to focus on EBA. That would be really hard with EEG. I guess with MEG you could try, but as far as my reading goes, the signals are still nowhere close to what you get with MRI in terms of their strength. So I think there is the possibility of using these two different techniques to get to two different properties of the same process. How do you put them together? And I don't even think that doing EEG and MRI combined can answer those questions necessarily. Like, I think we really need process models. Like we need to really sit down and be like, this is how we think the brain is doing it, instantiate it in an artificial neural network or whatever other system you want to use, and then make predictions which might be better than just thinking about this brain region does that at that particular time. But at the end of the day, we have to come down to these methods. There's nothing else we have, unless you want to use single cell recordings, and that's hard in humans. So
Thank you for that answer. Thank you for the question as well. We have to move on with the opposition. So we are now moving from the virtual USA to Nijmegen, where we have Artyom Belopolsky from the Free University of Amsterdam. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. Dear candidate, first of all, congratulations with a very nice thesis. I really enjoyed reading it. And I also would like to compliment you on the cover. This is the first time I saw that the cover was designed by AI. And I think it's actually a very appropriate cover for your thesis. So this is generated by OpenAI DALL-E 2 with the prompt, "A human searching smartly for fruit in chaotic kitchen." And cover art, I guess, also was included. But the human is scratching the head, so I guess is that smart or not? I'm not sure. But what else I think is very interesting is that the chaotic kitchen is actually not that chaotic. You actually have quite well-organized space that, we can figure out that this is actually a kitchen, and I think that's exactly what you were trying to convey in your studies, that the scene information is actually very important in structured environments, help us to guide attention to the things we want to find. However, I was a little bit disappointed that the whole scene guidance in your introduction, especially, and then in your studies, was reduced quite a bit to co-occurrence of stuff. So co-occurrence of distractors, of co-occurrence of targeting distractors, while there is this distinction proposed by Jeremy Wolf, I believe, that decomposes scene guidance into, or scene structure into syntax and semantics. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, and what would you consider that to be more useful concepts than basically just co-occurrence of objects in the scene?
Honored sir, thank you for your kind words. First, about the cover, I think I have quite some people in the audience who would agree with me that the scene is actually chaotic. I don't think a lot of my friends agree that this is a very ordered kitchen, but anyway.
It depends on your kitchen, I
Yeah,
guess.
exactly. Well, my kitchen is not like that, but still. And then coming to the more serious point, I agree with you. I'm not fully well read on the syntax versus semantics account, but there is this general trend right now where people are trying to understand scene processing in terms of its full richness. So, and one approximation to that richness is like a caption for the scene. And that has the syntax in the sense that you have the object relationships covered by this language, and you have the semantics because the word relationships also, like, they convey information about what that object is as given by its surroundings, as characterized by its surroundings. So I agree that is what we should focus on, but there are co-occurrences are a very small part of that entire game. Like if you have all the different elements that constitute the scene to semantics or scene to syntax process, then co-occurrences are also part of them. And how co-occurrences, how we use co-occurrences to parse scenes, how we use those co-occurrences to look through those scenes, we are at that stage, we don't even know answers to those questions. So we are like, let's start simple. Like we know how properties of objects can influence search. So we wanted to go one step above. So if you have two objects and they are arranged in a particular way, how does that influence search? You could go beyond, okay, now these two objects actually mean something, like an egg and an egg cup. And then if you like move, then if you break that structure, then what happens? And then you can scale it up to surfaces. So you have an entire kitchen counter versus the floor versus the ceiling. So I think like these are just degrees of the same process. However, I don't know how much what we show talks to the full model. It might be the case that this is such a small element of it that it's negligible, like the effect itself is small. And then I don't know how much these insights scale to the full model, but I would imagine this helps us intuit about what kind of things we have to think about in terms of the structure in the world.
Well, can I help you then? So
yes.
The syntax would be the physical constraints. At least that's how the authors define it. So yeah, what we know about the gravity and stuff like that. You actually described it very well in your introduction. That for humans, you would not typically search in the sky, right?
Yeah.
And the semantics would be that we understand somehow very quickly. You know, people can understand the scene. So, for example, if you know that you are like looking at paratroopers, you would probably will look at the sky, right? If you instructed to search for humans. So how do you think this corresponds? Is it really a big gap between looking at the relation between co-occurrence and really understanding the full scene and helping you guide attention?
I think that the examples at least you mentioned are to a large extent, that knowledge is to a large extent gained through co-occurrences, unless you read it in a book, that's a different thing. But like in experience, you would see objects in particular contexts, and that is how you situate them in those contexts. So I think co-occurrences play a huge part in like getting to this knowledge.
Okay. Then we can proceed to the second part if I still have some time. So then that's nice that you say that, because my second question was actually how do you model that? Because in your thesis you do model feature-based attention, but you don't really model, or maybe speculate a little bit in the introduction about the models of these types of scene structure. And if you say that these co-occurrences are important, I'm guessing that you want to model those. And how would you do this with existing architectures, with different approaches? I mean, everything is open right now. You have all the money, all the supercomputers at your service, all the labelers if you need them. And how would you do this?
I think it's already started because people are building networks which do, for example, captioning on MS Coco images, which have scenes where they have all the objects co-occurring and stuff like that. So I think you could look into those models and try to find signatures for how the model deals with two objects co-occurring with each other as compared to two objects that don't co-occur with each other, for example. You could look for the signatures there. You could actually build a model to do some sort of unsupervised learning on the stimuli from this study itself, and try to figure out how the model processes the display that makes it amenable for search. And that's where you can then start to compare the different accounts, right? There's this account that you need to explicitly know the structure and then use it like a top-down fashion to suppress it. And then the other account is that, but actually wait, the visual system, the feed-forward sweep itself could do these suppressions with some sort of center surround lateral inhibition kind of account if you have recurrence in the network. So I think like all the accounts I talked about can actually be modeled. I don't know how easy it is, but it is amenable to modeling. I did not do it, but I ended my PhD by that time. But it would be a fun project and informative, hopefully, to do that. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. And when you do model that, then look at this. If you search for some mistakes that the models make, sometimes the co-occurrences really give you a completely wrong answer. So if the objects do co-occur, then the networks sometimes really completely get in the way. Get confused. Yeah.
Thank you very much,
Thanks.
Dr. Belopolsky. So we will now move to our final opponent. We will move to the United Kingdom, where we have Professor Paul Downing from Bangor University as a final opponent.
Thank you very much, dear candidate, and I'd like to add my congratulations to the other opponents as well for a very well-written piece of work. I enjoyed reading this very much. I learned some things. That's always nice. I especially liked chapter 1, where you really start from first principles and you think about all of the kind of regularities and the support for search that's in the kind of structure of the environment, and then you ask, okay, what are the necessary mechanisms and processes to make use of those? But it struck me as a very optimistic and even optimal view of visual search. You call it smart search, okay, so that's a good title. Of course, if you ask people in life, they tell you about, oh, I couldn't find my keys, or you see people in a cafe waving frantically, trying to see somebody right in front of them, they missed them. And the literature has all these lovely examples of change blindness, inattentional blindness, attentional blink, all these failures. So what's your perspective on those failures, those lacks, those absences and lapses of attention? Is it just noise? Or do you think we can learn something from these?
Honored sir, that's an excellent question. I don't think it's noise. I think it's actually quite telling whenever you see a violation of what you think should happen. And I feel like when we see these violations in literature, it tells us about the other process that we are not thinking about. Like, for example, if I'm thinking about feature-based attention and I'm thinking about how my model should deploy feature-based attention and what kind of observations I should get given a particular stimulus, and I see a completely different behavior, then it might be just because the object processing stream, the part of the network which was involved in actually parsing the scene, was at fault. Something happened there, and then you can go look in it and be like, okay, there was something in the display which made the kitchen counter look like an animal, and that's why the network could not direct its attention to that part of the scene where the faucet was, for example. And that tells us something about the object processing stream then, but not the modulation stream. But then I was focusing on the modulation stream, but then I learned something about the object processing stream. So I feel like it's nice, like when we come up with these examples where we find deviations from what we think search should be like, because it just tells us more about the system, and then you just keep tweaking your models, you're just adding more information. So definitely useful.
Well, and make the models much smarter than the human observers eventually, right?
Well,
that's
that
would
be
the risk.
amazing.
or the aim, maybe. Yeah. Okay, so I also wanted to ask you about chapter 5, where you were looking at learning about novel pairs of items and the environment benefits on search. And I think you were surprised that you did not find spatial specificity or kind of positional specificity, that it didn't matter how these things were arranged, because in the search task with real world objects and scenes, of course, you do find. And you talk a lot about visual experience. Do you think that visual experience alone, enough experience to do your experiment for a year, would be enough to get those positional effects? Or I wonder what you think about the role of actually interacting with objects to use them, to pick them up, to hold them, to use them as tools. That may also be important to shape those regularities in a way that vision alone can't do.
I agree with you on that. I think at least the way I intuit it is that the more interaction you have with it, not just visually, you could even go from the scene being static to just a video of that scene, and then the next stage is you move around, so you get different copies and stuff like that. So the more rich the experience, I feel the easier it is to segment a particular element or a particular property in view from every other thing in view. So I would guess that if you actually can interact with this object in a 3D world or in person, you might actually get way stronger effects. Yes.
I think for me, the interesting question is more experience versus different kinds of experience. But,
I don't know.
We may not have time to explore that, I think, here in any detail. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
I'll hand that back to the chair.
Thank you. So then we can continue the opposition. So Professor Kietzmann kindly prefaced this already by expressing his pity that he couldn't get back to the question of switching. So can I invite Professor Kietzmann to continue the opposition with this extra question?
Of course. Dear candidate, you touched upon this briefly in your answer, and I hope that I didn't misread your thesis once again, where on page 46, you have a nice illustration where you give an account of recurrence, especially bias and gain, as being, and I quote, functionally equivalent to switching. You have this nice graph of basically bias and gain, and then you have this actual, binary switch. And I like I understand the reasoning behind it. I just don't think it's true. So it's a bit too black and white for me. So switching is a binary choice between.
I think we're done.
Thank you for asking that question. I'm afraid the answer to that question will have to wait for a different moment, but I am sure you will find that moment. The defense is hereby concluded, and I give the floor once again to the candidate.
Having defended my dissertation to the best of my ability, I would like to thank the rector and my supervisors and co-supervisor, as well as all those who have honored this ceremony with their presence. Thank you.
The doctoral examination board retreats for its deliberations.
Okay, we're chilling. Yeah, nice questions. Curveballs. Yeah, okay, now we can chill. Well, we still have to get to the beginning.
On behalf of the Doctorate Board of Radboud University, we have decided to award you the degree of doctor. I invite Professor Mededorp to discharge the task assigned to him.
In the name of the Lord, with the power entrusted by the law to the Doctorate Board, I hereby confer upon you, Sushrut Thorat, born in Kolhapur, the title of doctor from Radboud University, Nijmegen, to which are attached all the associated legal and customary rights and duties with respect to academia and society. As proof thereof, I present you with this doctoral diploma, signed by the rector and the doctoral thesis supervisors and co-supervisor.
Okay, you may now all sit down, and we will. The laudatio will be given by Dr. Palin.
Thank you. Dear Dr. Thorat, dear Sushrut, congratulations on successfully defending your thesis. I agree with the jury that this is a really great thesis, so many compliments also from me. I also want to congratulate your family, who I think is joining from India. They would have loved to be here, but it was not possible. But it's great that they are still able to witness the whole ceremony. Okay, so now that you've received your PhD degree, I think I'm allowed to say a bit about the path that brought you here. So I looked it up, and we first met in Italy in 2016, when you took my attention and perception course there at the Center for Mind Brain Sciences in Rovereto. As part of this course, you had to propose 2 research projects and select a paper to present to the other students. I don't know if you still remember this, but yeah. Interestingly, your first research proposal was about an fMRI study on the extrastriate body area. Your second proposal was about a behavioral study on attention in cluttered scenes with regularities. And the paper you picked to present to the other students was one on feedback modulation in visual cortex. So now, look where we are now, 6 years later, having made significant contributions to all of these topics yourself. Perhaps somewhere in the world, another master's student now selects your paper to present in class. However, while this suggests a straight path from your initial ideas to your final thesis, the road was obviously a lot more bumpy, as it usually is. Indeed, when you finished your master's degree, you were actually a bit lost. You enjoyed learning about the brain and the mind, but in the end, this didn't fully satisfy you. With your background in physics, you were instead drawn to the more computational side of things, particularly to the field of artificial intelligence, a field that really took off at that time. But in the end, perhaps partly out of convenience, you decided to join my new group here in Nijmegen, mostly focusing on cognitive neuroscience, as one of its first members. But with the agreement and the idea that you would also work with Marcel van Gerwen's group on AI-related projects. And this combination of cognitive neuroscience and AI has really defined your thesis, as we have seen, and also your research profile more generally. It also defined many of our discussions. And when preparing this Laudatio, I found out that this discussion already started in 2016, because for the project on attention, you proposed to use deep neural networks as a measure of saliency, testing which object parts most strongly affect the network's classification of that object. My comment at the time was, why not run an object recognition experiment in humans? Why do you need networks? I don't remember your answer, but maybe we can discuss that tonight. I think your idea was actually quite good. So as much as I tried to get you to focus on cognitive neuroscience during your PhD, you mostly read up on developments in AI, judging from the papers that were lying on your desk. However, when writing the introduction of your thesis, after already finishing all the other chapters, you also dived into the cognitive neuroscience literature, resulting in a very comprehensive literature review. Maybe I'm wrong, but I have the feeling that you enjoyed writing that more than you expected beforehand. And now in your new position as a postdoc in a more AI-focused lab, I think your cognitive neuroscience background will turn out to be valuable as well. So Sushrut, it was really great having you in the lab. When you were around there, it was always a lively discussion, whether it was about food, politics, or consciousness. In addition to your own projects, you also contributed in so many other ways to the lab, pushing others to clarify their concepts, for example, what they mean with attention, proposing alternative research designs, co-supervising students, and helping everyone with technical issues as well. Working with you was great fun, but also very challenging, and I mean that in a positive way. We spent many hours discussing experimental designs and even more hours discussing possible analyses, usually involving quadruple subtractions. You would frequently walk into my office and propose a complex idea or analysis while I was in the middle of writing a paper or preparing a lecture. This did not inhibit you in any way. You would just continue talking non-stop, perhaps also drawing a schematic on the whiteboard at the same time, while I was still trying to switch my mind to your study. But the discussions that followed often led to new insights or ideas. Or in other cases, you would conclude, well, never mind, forget about it. But even then, we often learned something about it. So Sushrut, I wish you all the best in your search for the optimal combination and integration of cognitive neuroscience and AI. Knowing you, I'm sure it will be a smart search. Congratulations.
I would like to add my congratulations also on behalf of the doctorate board. I think you did a fantastic job here today. Also extend my congratulations to your family as well as your scientific family sitting on the left here. Mm-hmm. The Radboud University values its promovendi very much, so I think you can be extremely proud of what you have achieved, and we really wish you a bright future. Before we're closing this ceremony, I would like to ask the people who are joining the ceremony, not here but on Zoom, to also say a few words to you. So we will do that again in the same order as during the opposition, but now probably in a much more relaxed fashion. And we will start with again with the Chair of the Manuscript Committee, Uta Noppenheim.
Congratulations to your thesis. As I said before, this was really impressive, and I learned a lot, which is the best. And I hope you have like great celebrations tonight and from now on. And I'm sorry that I can't be there. It came a little bit as a surprise by medical advice to myself this morning. But yeah, I hope we'll meet again at some point, I'm sure. Thanks.
Thank you. We move to Professor Kietzmann.
Great. Yeah. So let's come back to my question about the functional equipment.
in Osnabrück, yeah.
I'm kidding. Congratulations also from me to you, your family, and your academic family. I'm very thankful for you being part of my academic family now. I am also very thankful to your advisor on insisting on a cognitive neuroscience background, which now comes in very handy because it made you a very rare breed of people knowing how AI techniques work and how we can use complex models and how we can combine them with insights about cognitive neuroscience is something that I value very much. So thank you also to Marius and in this point. And yeah, it's good to hear from Marius. Some things seem to not change, and it's good that they are this way. And yeah, congratulations again, and I look forward to our continued work.
Thank you. Dr. Sturmer.
Yes, congratulations from me too. Again, it was a really, really great thesis to read and very interesting results. And yeah, I was very impressed with mostly the wide range of topics of using kind of AI and cognitive neuroscience, and kind of the breadth of your thesis was very impressive. So yeah, congratulations. I wish you the very best for your academic and personal future. And I hope I'll see you around at conferences and elsewhere.
Thank you. Dr. Lindsay.
Yes, many congratulations. It's always been great seeing you at conferences. Not a lot of people can talk about the intricacies of modeling visual attention with artificial neural networks with me. So very aligned interest there, and I look forward to seeing you at more places in the future.
Thank you. And finally, Dr. Downing, Professor Downing. Apologies.
Sushrut, thank you and congratulations from your academic grandfather, if I may be so bold. And I just want to say again, I very much enjoyed reading your work. All of your enthusiasm really comes through very strongly. And what can I say? I learned something. I enjoyed reading it. That's all we can ask, really. So congratulations again.
Thank you. So after all these celebratory words, we are now indeed coming to the final part of this ceremony, and I would like to ask you all to stand up for this last part. Gratias tibi agimus omnipotens Deus pro omnibus beneficiis tuis, qui vivis et regnas per omnia saecula saeculorum.
Good? We are done? Okay. Yeah.